Most of you will be familiar with the work that Edelman has done over the last 15 years or so on the subject of trust. The trust barometer has become, I think it's fair to say, the most prominent piece of public relations industry thought leadership. It's also evolved considerably in the time that I've been thinking about it, writing about it, examining it. In the early days, I think it was a sort of useful scorecard. It has become, in the last few years, much more diagnostic, much more actionable in terms of telling us how we as organizations can nurture trust, can leverage trust, and most importantly, from the perspective of an industry that's been wrestling with this issue for as long as I've been writing about it, how to measure trust. And we are fortunate to have with us today Toby Gunton, who leads Edelman's data and measurement practice here in London. And he's going to be talking about the measurement of trust and how that's moving forward. Toby.
Thank you, Paul. This does feel very, very strange. It's not just the shoes and the trousers, it's the standing up. It's kind of, I haven't done this for quite a few years. And no notes either. I've got lazy over the last couple of years. I don't know about you, but Zoom means that you've just always got notes at hand. So forgive me if I go wrong at any stage. Hopefully you won't notice. So yeah, I'm Toby. I look after Edelman's data and intelligence business across EMEA. There's about just over 100 of us. We've got a mix of data scientists, behavioural scientists, researchers, analysts, sort of you name it, they're sort of in that team. And unsurprisingly, I'm here to talk about trust. As Paul says, we are, as Edelman, we're pretty well known for trust. And I'm sure when you see anybody from Edelman on a panel discussion, you probably expect them to talk about trust, because we are a little bit obsessed with it. We've been talking about it and thinking about it for a long time. And increasingly, what I think we find is that a lot of the challenges that our clients give us, often we find that trust is part of the answer. It's actually part of solving the problem that they've got. When we really start to diagnose some of the issues behind it, we see that trust plays a really major role. And I'd argue that right now, trust is probably more important than ever. It's the new unprecedented. Everyone used to say unprecedented a couple of years ago. Now they're all talking about trust. It's in the headlines everywhere. So, you know, whether it is talking about the media, trust in media, whether it's talking about trust in the judiciary, the legal systems in countries, whether it's about politics, whether it's about influencers, trust has become this really, really important subject. And it's not really a surprise. Our most recent trust barometer, which we launched quite recently, really highlighted to us that we're in this kind of like vicious circle of mistrust. We've got this real trust deficit, and it's driven a lot by governments and media. And it's about division and disinformation. They're sort of almost weaponizing them for their own advantages, actually. So politicians are driving the polarization of society for their own success, and frankly, the media is all over disinformation in many ways for commercial gain. And that's left a real gap. It's left a gap for companies to kind of step in and play a role to fill that trust gap. But how do you do that? It's difficult. And well, we've been looking at trust, as I say, for a very long time. And that has allowed us to start to understand some of the answers. So I have to kind of read this really, don't I? It's meant to be like a big slide full of stuff to show you how much stuff we've done. But we've been looking at trust for 20 years. We've asked 25 million people about trust across 28 different markets. See if I can remember this. We've analysed over 3 million articles using AI and NLP to actually abstract trust and understand and infer trust from them. We've modelled over 100 companies' stock through a trust lens. We've analysed over 150,000 employee reviews, and we've done it for over 600 companies. So we really have spent a lot of time looking at trust. And as Paul said, in those early days, it was a nice piece of IP, but it's become something that has become much, much more important and much more actionable for us. And I want to try and highlight why trust is important, because we've learned a huge amount about the benefits that companies, businesses, and organizations that have high trust, about the benefits that they gain from being high trust organizations. So the first thing is consideration. Not really a great surprise. You are much more likely to consider buying a product or service from a company you trust. Yeah, it's kind of obvious, yeah? But actually, when you start to look at the data behind it and the numbers, it becomes very, very real. This is a really significant uplift. Two companies selling the same thing, if I trust one, I'm more likely to buy it from that company. But it's not just consideration. I'm actually more likely to purchase. Again, those two companies selling the same item, if I trust that company, I'm more likely to buy from them. And really importantly, I'm more likely to pay a price premium to a company I trust. And some of you have probably experienced this. I know I was buying some running shoes recently and I was shopping online and I found a company that was selling them a bit cheaper, but I'd never heard of them. I knew nothing about them. And then there was a company that they were a bit more expensive, not much, but they were a bit more expensive, but I'd bought from them before. I knew that they'd delivered, they'd come through, I trusted them. And I was prepared actually to pay a little bit more just to make sure that I knew that what I was going to get was what I thought I was going to get. So more likely to pay a price premium as well. And loyalty comes into it as well. We're much more likely, once we purchase from a company that we trust, we're 6 times more likely to actually buy again from that company rather than somebody else. And it's not just about purchasing behaviour. It's not about shoppers and customers. Trust affects your relationship with every other part of the business, all of those stakeholders around you. So, for instance, we know that trusted businesses tend to have 5 times as many people advocating for them. Yeah, it buys you that resilience. We know that trusted companies tend to outperform their sector by roughly about 5%. Yeah, we also know, interestingly, that in a time of a crisis, that actually increases to around 11%. So that trust buys you real resilience in very, very measurable ways. And of course, at this sort of really important point in time where we're all trying to retain the fantastic talent that we have working in our businesses, trust also helps drive employee retention. We know that companies that are highly trusted, we see retention is significantly higher than companies that aren't trusted. So we know that there's lots and lots of value in trust. It is proven to us many, many times over through all the companies that we work with, all the studies that we've done. So how do I would sum that up? So I'd say that trust is the ultimate currency in the relationship between organisations and people. It's the glue, it's the kind of magic stuff that makes things happen. If you've got that trust there, then that relationship is going to be stronger. It also defines an organisation's licence to operate, to lead and succeed, because it's not just about the relationship you have with individuals such as customers, it is all those other stakeholders. So trust impacts how policymakers see you, how lawmakers, how unions see you, how industry bodies see you. So your trust is really important as a business in terms of giving you permission to operate, giving you that license to operate. And it's also a foundation that allows organisations to take responsible risk. We're at a point in time where that unprecedented point in time, where there are a lot of challenges in the world, and businesses need to make some pretty bold decisions about what they're doing. If you're a highly trusted business, you've got the permission to make those decisions. You're underwritten by trust, because we also know that if you do make a mistake, if it goes wrong, that highly trusted companies rebound much more quickly than those that aren't highly trusted. Now, people talk a lot about how long it takes to build trust and how easy it is to break. But actually, the reality is, if you come from a highly trusted place, even if you make a mistake, it's easier for you to get back to that place afterwards and you get there quicker. I think that is really important. So trust is insurance against competitive disruption. It's an antidote to consumer indifference. It's the best path to continued growth. It is a secret weapon. Yeah? If you've got a new disruptive entrant into the market, if you're a low trust company, you're playing on an even playing field. If you're a high trust company, your customers are less likely to desert you because that new disruptor coming into the market, it takes time for them to build trust. If you've got that trust capital, people will think twice before leaving you. And we know that companies that are highly trusted, we see better levels of growth in them. So, no trust? People don't believe you. They don't believe the promises your brand makes. You have no credibility. If you've got no credibility, you're operating in a high-risk environment. And it's a high-risk environment of your own making. Yet, given that we know, and I think it's been proven not just by people at Edelman, but given that we know the value that trust brings to businesses, what's really surprising is that people don't often measure it. We tend to get obsessed with sentiment and reputation. So sentiment through things like social listening, and reputation through any number of trackers. These are the big sort of numbers that we look at. Sentiment often on a kind of daily basis, reputation, people look at all different times. But these are the big numbers that we look at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sentiment and reputation, and I'm going to talk about actually what they give you, but also some of the shortcomings they have. So, in the words of the late, great Whitney, I was challenged to sing this line, but luckily for everybody here, I'm not going to. Sentiment is all about a moment in time. And it is incredibly useful because what sentiment allows you to understand is the type of feeling and the depth of feeling that people have around that specific moment. That moment could be a product launch. It could be rolling out a new feature. It could be a product recall. It might be a marketing or comms campaign going out, or just the business being more generally in the news. And it allows you to take a really good sense check of what people feel at that moment. What is the way they feel about you and how strong is that feeling? What it doesn't do, though, is it doesn't give you the ability to understand how that feeling is going to impact those longer-term beliefs, the longer-term beliefs that people hold about you as a business. So reputation. Reputation is obviously incredibly useful. It gives you a great signal and sort of understanding of the health of your business. But I'd argue that reputation is a bit like looking in a rear-view mirror, whereas trust is a bit like looking out of the windscreen. Because trust is a belief about somebody's going to behave in the future, whereas reputation actually comes from what you've done in the past. And the reality about reputation is that it's often not built necessarily from your own personal experiences. Reputation tends to be a perception that you've gathered from a group. It may be what you've heard from others about their experiences. It becomes this sort of wider kind of perception point. And the reality is that if your individual experience of a business or a brand differs to the reputation, then your personal experience is going to trump that reputation. That reputation will mean nothing very, very quickly if your personal experience is not the same. And we also see that trust is a leading indicator for reputation. So again and again, what we start to see is that where trust goes, reputation follows. So when we see a company's trust score going down, it's not long before we see their reputation score going down as well. When we see that trust score going up, we see the reputation follows. So it's a leading indicator. Again, whereas reputation might be looking in that rear view mirror, trust is allowing you to see out the windscreen in front of you at what's coming. So unsurprisingly, I'd make the argument, and we would make the argument, that this is really a three-dimensional picture that we need. We need sentiment, we need reputation, but in order to get a really full picture that's going to allow us to make the kind of decisions that we need as a business, especially at the moment, we also need to understand trust. Because if you're only looking at sentiment and reputation, you are leaving the explanatory and the predictive powers of trust on the table. You're looking at two dimensions in what is really a three-dimensional environment. So let's just get a little bit deeper into trust and sentiment. I won't spend forever on this. I'm sure we probably could. There is a white paper that is being published. But we spent a lot of time really trying to just understand, okay, what are the differences between these three concepts? And we looked at the foundation, we looked at the construct, and we looked ultimately at the benefit that you can derive from them or from scoring highly in them. So if you look at sentiment, sentiment, as we say, it's about that single experience. It's a moment where you experience something and that makes you pleased, happy, unhappy, angry, whatever it might be. When you look at reputation, it's about like group consensus. So foundation's about a group consensus. It might be built on some of your experience, but it's also built on the experience of others. It's overheard. And when you look at trust, it's about multiple personal experiences. It's about actually how do you feel based on the interactions that you have had. Now, these three are not mutually exclusive. Let's just be absolutely clear. There are relationships between them, but we're trying to pull them apart to really understand how they work. When we look at the construct, sentiment, as I say, it's about emotion and it's transient. It's a feeling that you have, but actually it can change very, very quickly. And we see that. We see that all the time. Sentiment changes and can change very quickly. When you look at reputation, it's about perception and it's about the current status. It's about what's happening today. What's your perception of your business today? Whereas when we look at trust, it's about belief. It's about how do you believe that this brand or this business is going to behave and what it's going to do in the future. And it is based on those personal experiences. Ultimately, sentiment, really positive sentiment, might help you drive awareness of the good things that are going on in your business. Reputation definitely helps with consideration. If you've got a good reputation, clearly consideration is going to be key. But trust is about preference and loyalty. Trust, again, is about the idea that I'm going to come back, actually, because I know that I can trust you. So it's that lifetime value. It's arguably the most valuable piece of the puzzle. So to sum it up, sentiment, it's a moment in time, it's a singular experience. Reputation, it's a shared or collective perception. And trust is this deeply held belief based on multiple experiences. And we'd argue that trust is a new form of brand equity, very simply. I'll just leave that there for everybody to think about. So that's why we think it's really important to measure trust, because we can see that it's becoming more important all the time. We're in an environment where actually trust is lacking. Businesses have got that opportunity to step in. We can see the value. I mean, it's just undeniable, the value that can be taken from being a highly trusted business or brand. So that's why we need to measure it, because it'll allow us to understand where we're lacking and where we can build it. But how do you actually measure trust? Because it is intangible, or certainly it's intangible when you start looking at that problem. So the reality and the real answer to this is a lot of time, working with a lot of academics, partnering with a lot of academics, a lot of data scientists, a lot of business intelligence people, and a lot of software development. That's the reality. But actually what it really comes down to is two things. It comes down to data, and it comes down to a framework for that data. So what do we mean by data? Well, for several years, what we've been trying to do is start to measure trust through survey data. And that's been really, really useful for us. It's been really eye-opening, and it allows us to get to an interesting view of trust, to understand the dynamics of it, to understand where it's going, to be able to compare companies to their competitors, look at different audiences, et cetera, et cetera. But over time, what we started to do is add in lots of other data sources. So we look at panel data, financial data, employee reviews, product reviews, media coverage, social media conversation. There's all sorts of signals out there that allow you to understand how trusted a business or a brand is. Those signals are everywhere. And this is far from an exhaustive list, as I'm sure our data engineers would say. They'd probably kill me for a slide like this. It looks far too simple for what they do. But these signals are really, really important. And what I do want to point out here is because we have seen some approaches to measuring trust that just look at media coverage and social media conversation. That is absolutely not enough, because what we're discovering and what we've found over time is that every business has its own unique trust recipe or trust fingerprint. And it means that different elements are playing a different role in actually driving trust for that business. And media coverage and social media coverage, on average, will only drive about 30% of the sort of input that you need in order to change trust. There's other things, other actions, other behaviours that are having an input into how that trust is driven. But when we've got that data, we have to do clever things with it. We use machine learning and AI, natural language processing, even computer vision to try and start to understand actually and infer imagery from, trust from imagery. And again, it's really important here because although that media coverage and that social media conversation is not necessarily always the only driver for trust, it does play a role. And we needed to understand or infer trust from written words. So if a journalist writes something, is that going to help drive trust in a positive or negative way? A social media conversation, actually, is that showing positive or negative trust? And we are not a software company. We certainly didn't set out to be a software company. And we went out and we started looking for answers to this problem. Who could solve this for us? But what we found time and time again is that lots of people are claiming to measure trust, but what they're actually doing is they're using sentiment as a proxy for trust. And as we've seen, sentiment and trust are absolutely not the same thing. So we've needed to spend quite a lot of time to be able to understand and abstract trust data from unstructured data, or trust signals from unstructured data, written words. And I'm just going to dive into this a little bit because I think it's in the language and the words actually that you really start to get a sense of the difference between sentiment and trust. So sentiment tends to be much more emotional, much more ephemeral. Trust tends to be actually much more practical. It tends to be associated with concepts like ability, dependability, integrity, purpose, personal relevance. Trust actually has a mixture of emotional and very functional and practical language. And we, as I say, been building these algorithms, and the algorithms are learning. They are teaching themselves, frankly, at this stage. We just spend a lot of time training them early on. But there really is a very distinct difference. As I say, they're not completely separate. There are relationships between sentiment and trust, just as there is with reputation. but it is fundamentally a different concept, and we have to take a different way of understanding it. But what all that measurement does is it gives us a simple, single numerical score, which is quite useful. It allows us to track trust over time. It allows us to track trust by audiences, by markets. It allows us to compare ourselves to competitors, but it is only a single score. And this is where the framework comes in, because what we've really discovered is that there are a number of elements that make up that score. There are a number of ways that we think about the businesses and the brands that we interact with. And that framework is made up of 5 dimensions. So those dimensions are ability, dependability, integrity, purpose, and self. Yeah, these are the key dimensions that we look to measure. Because if we can measure these individually, we can start to understand with different audiences, well, hold on, where are we really low, where are we really high? Now, these dimensions, so far, everything we've done, every sector, every audience, every market, they are all viable. They all work for every single outcome that we've looked at. But let me just give you a little bit more of a description. So ability. Ability is like functional trust, okay? This is, I go to buy a car. Am I getting a good car? Are they capable? Is this company capable of just making a really decent car? Or is it pretty crap, okay? Do I trust them to actually do the job that they say they can do? Dependability. This is transactional trust. So if that car manufacturer says to me, hey, well, this car will do 60 miles to the gallon, will it actually do 60 miles to the gallon? Fantastic, okay, yeah, it does, great, that's dependability. The third is integrity. This is moral and ethical trust. So actually, does that car not do 60 miles to the gallon? But more to the point, did they knowingly sell me that car, knowing that actually it didn't do 60 miles to the gallon? They've just kind of, had one over on me. The fourth is purpose. This is societal and environmental trust. This is that car company actually adding something back to society? Are they perhaps looking at electrification of their entire lineup? Are they trying to solve future mobility problems? And then the fifth is self. This is personal trust. That's, do I look at this car brand and think, well, actually, I see myself in it. It reflects my values more broadly. Or do I look at it and think, actually, it's driven by a lot of bankers and I don't really associate with them? It's these 5 dimensions that make up the framework that we look at and the lens that we look at trust through. And as I said, there are these 5 dimensions. They are all absolutely relevant to different audiences. But what we tend to find is that we might need to weight them in different directions. So policymakers and regulators, dependability might be more important. For self-driven buyers and NGOs, purpose might be important. For investors, dependability might be important. So often what we'll do is we'll look at weighting the importance of these dimensions based on the different audiences that we speak to. Because, as I said, not all trust is created equal. And then finally, it's worth just saying that really, this is just the beginning of the process, because measuring and diagnosing trust is just a starting point, because trust is truly actionable. And I think, as Paul said earlier on, we used to just spend a lot of time kind of measuring it and talking about it. But actually, what we can do is we can go on to create strategies for businesses to help drive trust in a positive way. So once you've done that diagnosis, actually once you understand the strengths and weaknesses and conversely the opportunities and threats that trust can bring you, then you can start to think about how you activate against it properly. So when we're activating, increasingly we're thinking about how do we identify audiences based on their trust profile. So overlaying survey data with panel data so that we can actually find targetable attributes. We can start to build and shape audiences that we can actually go and target addressably. How do we understand the content or the messaging or the action that we need to take in order to shift trust? Yeah, what is the action? And also, what's the journey? What are the moments where we need to actually take an action with a particular audience in order to change that trust outcome? And then finally, it's about trust impact. What we're getting to now is we're starting to look at how we use econometric modelling to really tie trust back to the bottom line. So great, we've shifted your trust, but what real impact is that having on your key business KPIs? What's it really doing? And increasingly now we're starting to find ways and develop ways that actually allow you to understand the real impact of trust on the business in a way that you can take into any boardroom and get them to sign off on it, frankly. So look, we've talked a lot about trust. We talked about the fact that it's becoming more important. about how much value there is to be derived from trust for any business or organisation that is a high trust business or organisation. We've talked about the difference between sentiment, trust and reputation. And then we've looked at actually how do we get to that point where we can measure it? How do we build a framework around it so that we can actually make it actionable? But the first starting point really is to understand trust, because if you can understand it, you can use it to your advantage. If you can measure it and you can really analyse it, then you can absolutely use it to take advantage of all the benefits that it brings to your business. So that is all from me. Thank you very much.